This time, I would like to welcome Ms. Anaid Shaver. She is the Supervisor of College and Career Counseling Services here with Prince William County Schools. Welcome, Ms. Shaver.
Thank you, and welcome families and students. We are glad that you are joining us this evening to learn some very important information about scholarship and financial aid awareness. And we're excited to have a special guest who will share his experience and knowledge to help support you in your journey in looking for and researching information on scholarships and financial aid opportunities. I'd like to turn it over now to my administrative coordinator, Alyssa Bridges, to introduce herself and our guest presenter. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. My name is Alyssa Bridges, and I'm the Administrative Coordinator for College and Career Counseling Services, K through 12 in Prince William County. It's my pleasure to introduce Jason Perrier to you today. He comes to you and to us with a great wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. And we are just so incredibly grateful to have Jason with us this evening. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's always a pleasure to be here with you all and present on different topics with your students and families. I'm going to share my screen. I think I may need to be made a co-host to share.
You should be all set.
Got it. Thank you. So to begin, the College Place is a resource center that works with students and families as they navigate the post-secondary journey, providing free guidance and support along the way. So if you as a student or you as the parents of students are interested in getting your students signed up for more information, you can scan this QR code to request additional information from me along the way, although you're not required to do so as a part of participating with this session this evening. So my session is, originally we were going to do paying for college presentation that covered more of the, one second. Sorry about that, everyone. My son decided to come in and check on me for a moment. So forgive me, but originally when we were thinking about how to structure this presentation, we were going to cover financial aid from a very general perspective. But then federal student aid released the FAFSA early. So I shifted the focus of my presentation, and we'll still touch on financial aid basics, but the primary driver of the presentation this evening will be information about the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA form itself, since it's now open and available for seniors and parents to start working through. I want to make sure I'm answering as many questions as possible. If your student is not a senior, or if you don't have a student that is currently in college, you won't do anything with this form right now. But this information will help prepare you for what's coming in the next few years as you prepare for this process of paying for college. So like I mentioned, I'll spend a lot of my time with you all this evening covering the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. I'll also talk about scholarships and the steps that you can take no matter what grade you're in to begin securing money outside of the financial aid process to help your student afford their post-secondary education. And then I'll end, as I do many of my presentations, with the family discussions that I always encourage students and parents especially to have. No matter where you're at in this process, it's important to talk about how the student is going to pay for their education. So in Virginia, generally speaking, these are the 4 different types of applications you'll see in the financial aid process. For some students, depending on the institution that you're looking at, you may start and stop the process of applying for financial aid with the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, or the VESA. and I'll explain the differences between those two forms in a moment. Some colleges in Virginia do ask for the CSS profile in addition to one of the two forms that I just mentioned. And then last but not least are scholarship applications. Typically every May, I'll get a call, at least a call or two, usually from a worried mom, because the student has committed to an institution and they're trying to figure out how to cover sometimes the $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000 gap. To be perfectly honest, that's too late to have a lot of different solutions in front of us. So one of the things I always encourage students and families to do is not to wait until you've worked through the admissions and financial aid process. Seniors, you can start looking for scholarships now, and you need to apply for scholarships no matter what the admissions office or financial aid is telling you at an institution. It's always better to be safe than sorry. There are scholarships out there for any student, no matter their socioeconomic status, no matter their background, other identifiers. So you should be applying for scholarships in addition to everything else you're doing with the admissions and financial aid process as well. Until today, this slide said opens December 1st. But as I mentioned before, the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, is now live. So for anybody that's a senior, or for parents in the audience, if you have students that are already in college and continuing with their education, you can log in now to work through the FAFSA form itself. I've got a few recommendations when it comes to the form itself, what the first and most important thing is to make sure you're filling out the correct form. As you can see on the screen in front of us, once the current year's FAFSA launches, there's going to be two forms that are available to you. So the 25-26 form is the form that any senior that is going to graduate in the class of 2025 should be filling out. Any student that is currently in college looking for financial aid for the next year, this is the form we want to make sure you fill out. If you happen to fill out the 24-25 FAFSA and you reach out to me thinking you made a mistake, it was a mistake, but it's not the end of the world. Usually what I share with students and families that are in that situation is that that's great. You just had a practice run at the FAFSA. So let's get you into the correct year's form from there. The thing that matters in this process is the student status. So as long as the student falls into one of the categories in front of us, they are eligible to receive federal student aid, regardless of their parent status here in the US. Naturally, anybody that's US citizen, US national, they qualify for federal student aid, state aid, institutional aid, so on and so forth. If a student is a permanent resident or has a green card, if they were granted asylum, admitted as refugees, and their I-94s has that status has been granted and they're not in process to receive those statuses. If there's a date out in front of us in terms of expiration, those students are eligible to apply for federal aid. Any student that was admitted under an battered immigrant qualified visa, if they're in a household with a T visa, T1 visa, as long as a student falls into one of these categories, they're eligible for aid, again, regardless of what their parents' status is here. So where do we start this process? Again, for anybody in the senior year, seniors, you can set up your FSA ID this evening. If you want to have an additional tab open during this presentation and work through that process, you can do so. One of the things I always encourage students and parents to do is, as you're working through this form, if you have the physical copy of your Social Security card available, that's the best resource to use in this process. When I talk about verification that goes on the back end, once you work through creating your FSA ID, the Social Security Administration is the organization that's verifying this information once you submit it. So use your Social Security card. The only exception may be if your Social Security card says for work authorization only. Sometimes individuals that have been admitted as refugees and been granted asylum, your Social Security card will say for work authorization only, but you can still use that Social Security number generally to create an FSA ID. The exception is for anybody that is undocumented or out of status or has conditional status. If you have a Social Security number that's been delivered to you your card will say for work authorization only, but you will not use that social security number to create your FSA ID. Because there will be essentially a data mismatch with the Social Security Administration, and it'll create an error in this form for you. So say you're an undocumented student working through this process of creating your FSA ID. You'll check off the box saying that you do not have a social security number for the purposes of this form. And there's a verification page that'll happen at the back end of this process for you. For everybody else, verification is with the Social Security Administration. Give yourself 1 to 3 business days for your FSA ID to be verified by the Social Security Administration. You can technically create your FSA ID and start working on your FAFSA the same day while your ID is being verified. I just say give it the 1 to 3 business days, just in case. We haven't seen a lot of the same issues that we did last year, but I feel like it always works smoother to just wait for your ID to be verified before you attempt to log in and start the form. A student or their parent could start the FAFSA on the student's behalf. There are fewer errors when the student starts the form and invites their parent or their parents in to contribute information. You can only ever have one FSA ID, especially since it's tied to your social security number for those of you who have it in this process to use as an identifier. For those of you with children already in college, you already have an FSA ID that's been created to work through this financial aid process, and you'll use that same FSA ID for each student that you have going into and through post-secondary education. When you create this ID, you'll be offered the opportunity to use an email address, a phone number to answer challenge questions, or download an app to give you access to this account information again. I always encourage an all of the above approach to this because right now, especially for those of you working through the senior year of high school, all this information will be really fresh. You'll use this data at a few different points. You'll be logging in and out over the course of this academic year. But by the time we get to next year, you may have forgotten your login information or your FSA ID. Or for the students, if you're logging in 10 years from now to check your federal student loan balance, you may have forgotten your login information, and you may no longer have access to the email address that you used or the phone number that you used to originally create this ID. So just make sure you give yourself multiple ways to access this information. Once you submit for your FSA ID, again, you'll receive an email from the U.S. Department of Education saying, hey, thank you for submitting this form to request an FSA ID. And then you'll wait 1 to 3 days for your ID to be verified. This is different than the other place you'll see verification when it comes to creating your FSA ID. You'll be asked to verify your phone number and or email address that you use in your ID creation. That is not the same thing as this process on the screen in front of us, which is the verification that's happening with the Social Security Administration. And then once your ID is verified, you'll be able to sign in, begin the FAFSA, work all the way through, and complete the form. In previous years, whether the student or the parent was starting this form, everybody that was contributing to it could see all parts of the FAFSA form. Beginning with the 24-25 FAFSA, so last year's form, that changed. So part of the reason was to keep information more secure. The federal student aid has siloed the views of who can see what when logging into a FAFSA form. So the student, when they log in, they'll start with special or unusual circumstances. For students that are living with both biological parents who are married, this section is pretty straightforward. Usually special or unusual circumstances do not apply for them. If the student is living with anybody that is not a biological or adoptive parent, depending on the reason, they may have to answer a few different questions that come up in this section. This is where students are determined to be dependent or independent for purposes of federal student aid. Very generally, a young adult that's under the age of 24, who's not married, does not have a child who depends on them for more than 50% of their support and care, or is not a member of the military, will be dependent for the purposes of federal student aid. The only exception comes in when someone is not living with their biological or adoptive parents. The reason behind that is important. If they're just staying with an aunt or uncle because it makes sense logistically for the school that they're attending, that's one thing. That wouldn't apply in this scenario. They would still use their biological or adoptive parents' data in this process of applying for aid. On the other hand, if a student was in the foster care system anytime after the age of 13, they would enter that information in as they start working through their FAFSA, and then they would be determined to be independent for purposes of federal student aid. So it's a case-by-case basis, and there's a lot of nuance to this. I won't describe every situation that will qualify a student one way or the other, but generally speaking, as a student works through this form, that will determine who needs to report what from there. The student will then answer demographic questions like where did they go to high school? What does their household look like? And they'll answer questions as they work through that section of the form. And depending on what they answer and how they were categorized through the special and unusual circumstances section, that will determine which parent or parents or no one needs to contribute additional information to this form beyond the student's section itself. Section 3 is the financial section. Once you've created your FSA ID, one of the things that you'll be asked to do is to provide consent and approval for the IRS to verify whatever data is there for the person's FSA ID. So for students who are not working, what the IRS is doing at that point is they're verifying is that there's no tax year information on file at that point to consider in this process. It is definitely needed to provide that consent and approval. One, because once the FAFSA form is submitted, the IRS is where the data is checked anyway, whether the data is automatically imported into the FAFSA form itself or someone is doing manual entry. For most students, providing consent and approval, the data is encrypted and transferred over directly. That's the best route to go for a few different reasons. One, it prevents data error, typing error from creeping into this process. But two, for any individual contributor that does not provide consent and approval for information to be shared from the IRS into this form, the student will not be eligible to receive federal aid outside of unsubsidized loans. So I always encourage students and families to be very careful when you're working through this part of the form. My recommendation is to provide that approval, consent and approval for the information to be transferred directly over from the IRS into this form. On the colleges portion of this form, the student can list up to 20 institutions. My recommendation is usually for seniors not to apply to that many colleges. But if you have that many colleges on your list, one, please make sure your college and career counselor is aware of the number of schools that you're applying to. But once you submit your FAFSA and that data information has been sent out to colleges and universities, you can log back into the form, delete school codes out from the form that was already submitted and add additional school codes in. Say you're applying to 30 schools, you would list the first 20, make sure your form is submitted. Once your ISR has been received by the institution, you can log back in and delete 10 of those schools and add the additional 10 that you need to work through this process. You'll be asked one more time to provide consent and approval in this process towards the end of this form if you declined to before, and then you can use your FSA ID to sign the FAFSA form itself. At that point, the student may be entirely done with this process. If they were determined to be independent for purposes of federal student aid, once they reach this point, they sign and submit, they're applying through the FAFSA is done. For a dependent student, they're not. This is just the first step. That when you list your parents' information in the demographic section of this form, they will be identified as a contributor or contributors depending on your household situation. And this is what the parent contributor will see when they log in to contribute to a FAFSA form. So in a household where both biological or adoptive parents are married, filing a joint tax return, only one will be identified as a contributor to the FAFSA. If parents are married, filing separately for any reason, the parents will both be identified as contributors because each individual at that point would have to provide consent and approval for their individual taxpayer information to be transmitted into the form securely. If biological or adoptive parents are no longer married, then the parent that's providing 51% or more of the support will be identified as a contributor. And in situations where biological parents say it's 50-50, that is technically left up to the student. If you read on the federal student aid website, their advice is to, in those situations, list the parent who has the higher income and assets. But ultimately, there's no real way for federal student aid to check that. So in those situations, it's left up to the student to list their contributing parent or parents at that point. But when that contributor logs in, when each contributor logs in, they'll say, Jerry has invited you to contribute to their FAFSA. And when you log into your FSAID account or your federal student aid account, you'll see that in your dashboard that you've been invited to contribute to Jerry's FAFSA. So you log in and this is what you see. You'll fill out demographic information to be added into the form, confirming some things that have already been entered in by the student. In the financial section, you'll be asked to provide approval and consent for your information to be transmitted over directly from the IRS. Though in some situations, especially if you filed an amended return, you may be prompted at this point to manually input information into the FAFSA. If that is the case and the form itself is prompting you to do so, your student will still be considered for all federal aid that may be available to them, not the other situation where I described declining consent and approval and only being eligible for unsubsidized loans. There was some confusion about that last year when students and families were directed by the form to manually input information. Some were worried that they would not receive all the aid they were eligible for. But there are some situations where the form itself would direct you to do that. And as long as that's the case and you're not declining to provide consent and approval, you're good to go in terms of the student being eligible to receive any aid, federal aid they're eligible to receive in this process. And then last, you'll use your FSAID to sign this form. The way that this process has worked the smoothest, at least in the last year from my experience, is to have the student start the form, to work all the way through to the signature page, stop before signing, let the parent or parent contributors log in and do all their sections, sign with their FSAID, and then once that's done, the student goes back, reviews everything that they can see from their end, use their FSAID to sign, and then submit the FAFSA form. There are situations, because the last person in, essentially, whichever contributor that is, whether it's a student or a parent or another parent, whoever is the last person to provide that signature is submitting the form on the student's behalf. There's a few different reasons that I recommend the student being the last one in. One, because when the student submits, they may see what their student aid index is on that next screen that loads, if they're eligible for the federal Pell Grant, federal student loans, and some data release information that they can use later in this process. But it's only on that screen right after submission for the student's view. When a parent submits and is the last one in, you just get a thank you for submitting the form. So there's very little data at that point. You'll eventually get access to that data, but for any students or parents who are wondering and want some initial information directly in this process, have the student be the last one in the form, signing and submitting their section. Again, if you have questions about it, generally speaking, students, biological or adopted parents who are married, living together in the same house, it's straightforward. One of them will be identified and both parents may be reporting information. There were some errors last year when students were trying to list both parents. I think that's been cleaned up in this process. But for now, especially since the FAFSA format is still in the 3rd and 4th round of beta testing for this year, my recommendation is for the student to list one of their parents, and then when that parent logs in to do that contributor information, they'll list their spouse and contributing information in this process. From there, though, again, if parents are separated, no longer living together, or were never married, the student will be prompted to identify the parent who's contributed 51% or more of the financial support, and that's the parent that will be adding in information. Word of not caution, but a word of general awareness. If the parent that you're living with, the student has remarried, your step parent may be identified as a contributor in the process of applying for financial aid. That surprised some families last year because that was a little bit different structurally than what happened in previous years with the FAFSA. And so then the step parents information would be reported in this form as well. And that can be the case in some situations for the parent that the student does not live with. If they've remarried, sometimes the non-custodial parent and their spouse have been getting identified in this process of needing to be contributors for the form. Just because you're being asked to contribute information to the FAFSA form itself does not mean federal student aid is expecting you to contribute towards the student's cost of attendance at any college or university. You're just contributing information for federal student aid to make an initial assessment about what the need is there from a financial aid standpoint. All the people on the screen in front of us are not financial aid contributors, financial aid parents, for the purposes of contributing to this form. So if the student is living with a cousin, aunt or uncle, older sibling, widowed step-parent, grandparents, as long as those individuals have not legally adopted the student, they are not contributors for the purposes of federal student aid. If the biological or adopted parents are deceased, as a student works through their FAFSA form, they'll be sharing that information as a part of the data entry process. Then they'll be asked who they live with physically, but that person would not be identified as a contributor again unless they've legally adopted the student. If court has placed a student with another family member for a multitude of reasons, that person also will not be identified as a contributor for the purposes of federal student aid, again, unless they've legally adopted the student as well. From there, it's easy to make a mistake. One of the first one that's listed here is not using your legal name as it shows in Social Security Administration records. I always like to share that I was one of those students that made this mistake in my process of applying for financial aid. My mom spelled my name one way on my Social Security card and another way on my birth certificate. And going through school, I had seen my birth certificate in terms of getting registered each year for classes, having my immunization records submitted and updated. It was something I saw, and that's how I spelled my name. So I spelled my name the same way when I went in to fill out my FAFSA form. And this was back at a time where you could still do a paper FAFSA. But I got flagged for an error because the spelling of my middle name did not match my Social Security card. So before having my own child, I did not understand how that could happen. But now having my own son and knowing when those forms are requested, I get it. I understand why my mom may have not been had everything all together when she was being asked to write this information down. And she had twins, so she was doing this twice in the process. So use your Social Security card. If you make a mistake when creating your FSA ID, you can log in to fix it. Sometimes, though, you may have to call federal student aid and get an administrator on their end to fix it, depending on which data point we're talking about. So just be careful. Use your Social Security card as you're creating this ID, just to make sure you're avoiding this issue as you work through this process. If you list an incorrect tax filing status, that's an error that we've seen. Manually submitting financial aid information when you're not being directed to can cause errors just because you transposed a period where there should have been a comma or vice versa. So that happens. Leaving your contributor information incomplete, either from the student side or a contributor logging in and providing incomplete information can cause an error in this process. No matter what happens, if there's an error that pops up, just log back in to fix it, especially if this is happening before the priority deadline for financial aid has passed at an institution. If you catch these errors early in this process, log back in, fix it. You file an amended FAFSA at that point, but you're not missing anything in terms of financial aid process overall. Once you submit your FAFSA and that form has been processed, I'd give it, especially right now, if you're trying to submit your FAFSA, I'd give it a week or two before expecting a response from federal student aid, because if the submission volume is high, they're scaling up from where things have been getting submitted earlier in this process, but it's not uncommon once the form is made available to all students and families to complete, that you could see some delays in processing initially. So keep that in mind. But once you submit the FAFSA again, you'll be looked at to determine your eligibility for the federal Pell Grant, which this year is $73.95 per academic year. That's the maximum that you can receive from Pell. The Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or FSCOG grant, is money that's given directly to colleges and universities to disperse as they have determined need. So that fund ranges, those awards range from $400 to $4,000 at the maximum, but will vary from one institution to another. Pell, if a student receives it, should be the same number at every institution they've been offered admission into and receive financial aid information back from. That number should be consistent. For any student that wants to become a teacher, there's a Teach Grant that they'd work with the school that they enroll in to get access to funding to help them pay for their education. Some colleges that provide access to the Teach Grant may say that you cannot access this fund until you matriculated into a teacher education program. Sometimes that may be as late as your junior or senior year of college, depending on how they've structured the program. So just make sure you're talking to the financial aid office of the school that you're enrolling in at that point to see what that timeline looks like. The word of caution here is that if you, because there's a service requirement on the back end, you have to teach for 4 years in an area of need or a subject of need at a school in need. If you don't complete that service requirement, the Teach Grant becomes a loan with unsubsidized interest that will be added to it from the day the grant was initially distributed to the student. So just be careful there. For anyone that wants to become a teacher, we need more great teachers all throughout our country. So thank you for considering that as a career field, but you can use the Teach Grant definitely to help you pay for your education. Anyone that's wavering, think about it critically before accepting those funds to pay for your education, because there's a service requirement on the back end that you need to fulfill to make sure that always stays a grant, so money you don't have to pay back in this process. And the last but certainly not least on the screen in front of us is the Iraq and Afghanistan Service Grant. That's for any student who lost a parent and guardian in active duty service to a country in the areas described in the grant's name itself. And based on information that the student puts into their demographic information section of the FAFSA, that information will be verified by the Department of Defense, Veteran Affairs to confirm the student's eligibility to receive those funds. So that's non-need based, where federal Pell FSCOG will depend on the student aid index, or the number that will be generated once the student has successfully completed their FAFSA, submitted it, and that form has been processed. So keep that in mind. This is usually where I lose my families in Northern Virginia, but hang in there with me as we work through the next two charts. One, because federal Pell Grant is not the only grant that's available from the federal government, so keep that in mind. But this is the table that determines eligibility for those grants in a single parent household. On the left of the screen, you see number of family size, and then what you had to fall under in terms of the adjusted gross income, or AGI, to qualify for max Pell. So it's not gross income, it's your adjusted gross income that's considered in this process. Anything between these two middle columns, the student will receive partial Pell. Anything above these numbers, depending on family size, you won't be eligible for any Pell, but that does not mean you're not eligible for other federal, state, or institutional aid. So it's always worth your time to complete the process of filling out the FAFSA and submitting that form in terms of applying for financial aid. Similar concept, but for a two-parent household. This is where the numbers stand at. Again, this is usually where I lose my families in the DC metro area, because especially if you have two parents that are working full-time in this area, the adjusted gross income is usually above these ranges, regardless of the family size. But again, don't give up. Don't think that you won't get anything out of the financial aid process. One, because at the very least, you'll get a student aid index number that you can use when you're applying for scholarships, because there'll be organizations that will ask you for this data. And if you have not completed your FAFSA successfully, you won't have that data to use in the process of applying for scholarships. So you'll need it regardless of what that SAI says in this process. So it's always worth your time to work through the process of filling out this form in its entirety. These are some of the Virginia grants that are available. I didn't mention it when I was on the federal grant slide, but those are not all the federal grants that are available to help students pay for college. Those are the most common, most frequently seen, the largest in terms of the budget allocation in the process of aid that can pay for school. The same concept is here. These are the grants that we see most often in the process of applying for financial aid and for students attending different types of institutions within the Commonwealth of Virginia. But these are not all the state grants that are available to students pursuing education in Virginia either. Commonwealth Award and Guaranteed Assistance will both be dependent upon the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. Guaranteed Assistance, though, will depend on GPA as well. So I won't go through all the requirements for all these grants on the screen in front of us. What I will say is that no matter the grant that you're looking at from the state end of things, that there are different requirements and metrics that have to be hit. Sometimes each year that the student is in school pursuing their education. So especially parents, as your students, as your children are receiving their financial aid award letters, if you see grants like this, especially from the state or also from the federal government, make sure you're reading what the requirements are to keep these grants, to make sure that it's not just a one-time thing the student is receiving. If they're going to receive it every year, what are those requirements they need to meet to make sure they keep receiving those funds to help them cover their cost of attendance as we move through each year of college. The student may be determined to be eligible for work study. There's federal and institutional work study depending on the college or university that we're talking about. But essentially, work study as a program offers high school or college students part-time work to provide financial assistance to help them pay for post-secondary ed. In the context of colleges and universities, it's most common to see federal work study, so dollars that are given directly from federal student aid to the institution that the student is enrolled in to help them pay for their cost of attendance. But the student does need a job, typically on campus, and to clock the hours to earn these funds, whether it's a federal work study position or an institutional work study position. I always encourage students, if you are offered federal work study funds, use that as a way to pay for your education. Because it connects you to somebody on your campus who knows your institution really well. And that work study supervisor is not only focused on you doing a good job, but making sure you graduate on time and are finding success academically as a student at the institution. And because they are well connected, typically they know where to go if you have questions or you get tripped up along the way in your academic journey. So it's always worth it to pursue these opportunities from my perspective. I've worked at 2 different institutions in the Commonwealth of Virginia and had federal work study students in both of my offices. It was always worth it for my students to have access to those funds. One, because they got connected to resources at the institutions. And again, I was focused on making sure they were graduating on time. That was a part of my work as a supervisor. You can climb a mouse. Federal student loans are the last piece that will be made available through the process of completing and submitting the FAFSA for the upcoming academic year. Subsidized loans are based on the student aid index, so they are need-based. Interest technically does accrue on these loans, but as long as the student is enrolled making progress at least on a part-time basis towards their degree or certification, that interest is paid by the Department of Education. Right now, the interest rate is 6.53%. Every year, typically around July 1st, that interest rate will be set depending upon what decisions the Fed makes at that meeting in the summer. Unsubsidized loans are non-need based, so they're not dependent upon the student aid index, which is why if a student or a parent contributor declines to provide consent and approval for information to be transmitted directly over from the IRS, they still may be offered unsubsidized student loans because those are not dependent upon the student aid index. Borrower is responsible for the interest from the time that loan is dispersed to them. And then last but not least, in terms of what I'll mention on this slide, is the Parent Plus loan. Some colleges, universities that your student is admitted into are really great about highlighting that they're asking the parents to utilize the Parent Plus loan to help their student pay for college. Other institutions aren't great about highlighting that it's a fund that the parent is being asked to tap into and not the student. There is a credit check that you do have to pass as a parent contributor to get access to these funds to help your student pay for college. I did hear that there was a rumor circulating earlier, not necessarily from anyone in Prince William County, but that someone was advised not to complete the FAFSA because there was a credit check for the FAFSA form itself. That's not true. The only place the credit check comes in is if you're looking to utilize a Parent Plus loan to help your student pay for college. That's the only place that this comes in into this process. But the biological or adopted parent is responsible for paying those funds back from a Parent Plus loan. Whereas a subsidized or unsubsidized loan, those are dollars borrowed in the student's name that the student is responsible for paying back. That's the FAFSA in a nutshell. There's a lot more information that I could have shared, but I tried to just give you a very high level overview of what you'll see in this process. If you have questions as you go through this process, please start with your college career counselor. I work with everyone in the Prince William County system, and they're all great. And if they don't know, usually they reach out to me to ask me a question. So start with them first and let's make sure we get you good answers as you work through this process. I will be probably at all of your schools at different points during the spring to help students sometimes individually work through this form. Sometimes it'll be for a FAFSA night that will be a partnership between a few different high schools. So you'll see me around. We can get help. There is no dumb question to ask in this process. Even if you've worked through the financial aid process before, sometimes parents will hesitate to ask questions. Our goal is to make sure you have the information you need to work through this process and to get any aid your student is eligible for to help them pay for college. So please ask away as you work through this process of applying for financial aid. I am time limited, so I'm not going to jump into questions here, but I'm going to go into my next section and talking about scholarships and what you can do no matter what grade you're in terms of applying for scholarships. So simply put, scholarships are dollars that are awarded sometimes by a college or university, sometimes by an independent nonprofit, sometimes by a religious association, group, facility to help a student pay for their education. Scholarships are free. So it's money that you don't have to pay back no matter which agency it's coming from, unless you're not fulfilling the requirements of that agency. And this comes into play sometimes with there's some organizations that require you to maintain a certain GPA to keep getting access to those funds, or maybe there's a certain number of community service hours they want to see you complete within an academic year or during your college education. As long as you're hitting those benchmarks and meeting those metrics, you're good. But just be careful once you're awarded funds that you're making sure that you are keeping your eligibility in place, especially if the scholarship is being given to you every year that you're pursuing your education. These are some general statistics when it comes to the scholarship process. There's 1.7 million individual scholarships that are awarded annually. Those are mostly from private organizations, but this includes colleges and universities, civic organizations, everything you can think of in this process. So numerically, there's a lot out there to search through and to look for. The average scholarship is worth about $7,400. But scholarships, in terms of what you can apply for, range from $250 to $5,000 to the total cost of attendance for a student for all 4 years or for more. So it varies from one institution to another. The Department of Education itself awards for $46 billion in scholarships annually. You only get access to that funding by completing and submitting your FAFSA by the priority deadlines that we work through this process. A student who receives a scholarship grant at a private college generally receives about $10,000 more than students at a public college or university. Cost of attendance is a factor there. Private institutions do have the ability typically to award more scholarship dollars than a public institution, but just make sure you're checking the math and making sure that the cost of attendance and everything's factoring into your favor before you make a decision on that end. Athletic scholarships are offered to less than 2% of high school student athletes. So if you're looking to pursue this route to help you pay for college, it's great. Have honest conversations with coaches, recruiters, whoever you're working with in this process. One, to ask them what the scholarship covers. Some coaches are able to offer full ride scholarships that cover the complete cost of attendance. Some coaches are not. Sometimes they're only able to offer tuition scholarships. So at some institutions that may cover 2/3 of your cost of attendance, at others it might only be half, might be a little less. So have that conversation with the coach recruiter as you work through this process to make sure you understand what you could receive as a potential student athlete. One, keep your grades up and make sure you're fulfilling all the other requirements that the coach is asking of you to make sure you're securing those funds. And then over 100 million goes unawarded in scholarship dollars every year. And that's simply because students aren't applying. So there is no scholarship that is too small. If it's providing you free money to pay for your education, it is absolutely worth your time to apply for that scholarship. If your college and career counselor is chasing you as a senior down the hall, begging you to apply for a scholarship, there's a good reason. Usually that organization hasn't received a lot of scholarship applications or any. So it is in your best interest, especially if your college and career counselor is begging you to fill out this application, to make sure you do that in this process. From there, sometimes when I meet with students and families, these are some of the myths that will pop up in this process. One, that scholarships are too competitive, especially when you just start filling out scholarship applications. It can feel like that, especially when you're not hearing back from different organizations in terms of their decisions. I get that. One, don't get discouraged. Keep plugging away and applying for scholarships. Especially if you're in your sophomore or junior year, as you're looking through scholarship organizations and websites, you may find that there are some scholarships that are only available to students in their senior year or that are already in college. One, don't get frustrated. If you fit the other parameters for those scholarships, make sure you write those schools down, either on paper or digitally, and you're tracking that because you want to make sure you apply for that scholarship in future years. But then look to see if there are other opportunities either from that same organization. Maybe the scholarship is named something different for underclassmen versus seniors. Make sure you dig through and do some research on that end, because not only high school seniors can apply for scholarships, students of any age can apply for scholarships. They are sometimes more targeted towards seniors or those already in college. Keep that in mind. You can apply at any grade level, especially once you get into high school. It is rare for anybody before high school to get access to scholarships, although not unheard of. It is rare as compared to high school students. And then small scholarships are absolutely worth applying to. Some students who are very successful in this process have gotten through this process of applying for scholarships by only applying for small dollar scholarships, $250, $500 scholarships. Because they were easier to apply to, they could apply to 50 or 100 of them. And if you're getting 20 to 30 out of 100, you're still building up a substantial amount of money in scholarship dollars to help you pay for college. So it's absolutely worth it, no matter what the scholarship amount is to apply for it. These are all the different areas that you can look for scholarships. So don't just think about the college or university that the student is applying to or may have already been admitted into or that they may have already committed to. That's one great place to make sure you're turning over every leaf in terms of what scholarships are available. Sometimes there's a separate application through the Alumni Association or another affinity group that you have to fill out in addition to the other financial aid forms to get access to those institutional scholarships. So please make sure you pay attention to that. But consider outside organizations. Consider any businesses that are looking at preparing the next generation of engineers, accountants, astronauts. If that's the area that you're looking to go into professionally, they may have a scholarship that's available for you. Think about private foundations. Think about different government organizations. Sometimes there's funding to either set you up on an externship or an internship over the course of the summer. And as a part of that commitment, because maybe the governmental agency is not able to pay you as much as a private sector position, they'll offer you educational benefits in terms of a scholarship to help you pay for college in future years. Think about charities. This is where parents are sometimes really helpful. Parents, if you've donated any dollars, consider where you've donated funds to and look back to see if they give scholarships out. Sometimes you have to donate to an association or organization to be eligible for those funds. Sometimes you don't. It depends on which organization we're talking about at that point. Parents, this is also where it's helpful to think about educational benefits that your employer may provide to you. Sometimes those are in forms of scholarships. Sometimes it's in the form of grants. And then students, if you're working, also think about educational benefits, which you may never have considered before. But this is an area where you can also look for scholarships, and there's also individuals that give out scholarship dollars. Just make sure you're using common sense in this process. If something feels too good to be true, it generally usually is. Although there are some really amazing scholarships out there that if you get them, it can feel too good to be true because it covers your total cost of attendance. Those are legitimate typically for those organizations. But if any organization is asking you for your credit card information or checking account information to hold a scholarship for you, it's not worth it, because simply put, you shouldn't pay for free. So if a scholarship is free money to help you pay for college, never pay for it in this process of getting access to the information, receiving the funds on the back end. These are the different types of scholarships that you may see available. Merit, based on your GPA academics. Need, will be based on your student data index. Identity, how you literally walk through this world, how others see you, how you see yourself, will be a factor. What career you want to go into, or what type of college, whether it's a 2-year, 4-year, public, private, religiously affiliated, not. There are different scholarships that are out there depending on the type of institution that you're enrolling in. Think about eligibility components. Think about where you live. There are scholarships based on being a student in your county at particular colleges and universities in Virginia, sometimes outside of the Commonwealth. Think about your citizenship status. Sometimes that's a driver, as a primary driver in the process of applying for scholarships. Think about how you see yourself and walk through this world. Sometimes seniors hesitate when I ask them that question, like, how do you see yourself? How do you identify? These are factors in terms of scholarships. I start off with asking it when I'm talking to an audience of students if there are any natural redheads in the audience, because there are scholarships for redheaded people out there. And I'll ask students to raise their hand if they're left-handed. There are scholarships out there for left-handed individuals. Literally think about everything that describes you in the way you walk through and experience this world. And there's typically a scholarship out there that will hit one of those attributes that you have. There are different scholarship requirements. Again, these are different things that organizations will look for. You don't always have to match all of the attributes that an organization is looking for unless the scholarship explicitly says it. There are some organizations out there that you may see a lot of students of a particular demographic, whether that's their faith, religious, ethnic background receiving, but that does not mean that that's the only type of student that can receive those funds. Make sure you're looking at the website, looking at all the different attributes and markers that you could hit. Sometimes it's more about being first in your family to go to college, or wanting to be an engineer from an urban setting that can qualify for a scholarship. So please keep that in mind as you work through. You may be required to submit additional information as a part of this process. If a scholarship organization is asking you for your official transcript, please give your college career counselor, your school counselor, at least 2 weeks notice on these requests. If you ask within 24 hours of a scholarship submission deadline, you might not get that information on time to submit it. Please don't do that to your college and career counselor. It's going to stress them out. It's going to stress you out. But if you're in that situation where time is really tight, reach out to the organization and see if they'll accept an unofficial transcript, which usually the student has access to, very generally speaking, and see if they'll accept that in the meantime while you work on getting them an official transcript from your school. You may also be asked to provide your student data index, or SAI. That's information you're only receiving from the FAFSA, or if you're filling out the VESA for any reason in Virginia, to include in this process of applying for scholarships. I'm going to push ahead because I know we're running close on our time. But if you're asked for a letter of recommendation, same piece of advice from the transcript request perspective. Ask at least 2 weeks in advance. Give your recommender time to write a compelling letter of recommendation for you, and tell them thank you for submitting that for you in this process. When it comes to the essay and short answers, please read the prompt and answer every part of the prompt fully. Sometimes, and I've reviewed scholarships at the local, state, national level. Sometimes it's really easy to cut my scholarship review in half because I look at the prompt, and for the students that didn't answer all parts of the prompt, they're out of the process of being considered for a scholarship. So sometimes it's as simple as just answering the question as fully as you can to put yourself in a position to be competitive for the scholarship. Say thank you to individuals that are helping you navigate this process. If you're telling your college career counselor thank you when they see another scholarship that they think is a great fit for you, you're going to be the first student that pops into their head. If you thank your math teacher for writing a really great recommendation letter for you for a future engineering scholarship, if they see another one, they're going to think of you and make sure you have that information to fill out that scholarship application. Sometimes a year or two after you graduated, they may be thinking about you in college because they saved that your thank you note that you sent them on the board beside their desk. So it's always important to show gratitude in this process, but do avoid scams. Anything that says anything like this, like the scholarship is guaranteed or your money back, again, don't pay for free. We'll do all the work for you. They can't. You have to fill out these applications yourself. If they ask you for any credit card, bank account information, please don't submit it. It could be a way that somebody's out there fishing for your sensitive data, and then you've been subjected to identity theft, and that takes time and sometimes a lot of money to recover from. So please practice some caution as you're looking through different websites to search for scholarships. Those search engines are not perfect. So sometimes you'll see some scholarships that have prepped through that will ask you for some of those things on the previous slide. So just be careful as you work through this process. But create a system, stay organized. Students, this is where your parents can be really helpful. If your parents have to wake you up in the morning to get on the school bus, you're probably gonna need the help from them to keep you on track in terms of applying for scholarships, or at least keeping up with the scholarships that you applied for and where you need to send information or receive information from. But you got to commit time to this. Like anything, it's a question of whether or not you're going to commit time to the process in terms of what you're going to get out on the back end. Write a strong essay that you can reuse over and over again in this process. Just make sure that if you're doing that, change one organization's name to the other, or change the institution's name to the right institution. It's not a deal breaker, but if you're otherwise equally competitive to another finalist, an error like that could make a difference in terms of the review. So just give yourself time to edit and check as you're submitting these applications. But start local, start with your college career counselor. Please go to Naviance on a regular basis and check to see what is available to you. Both for students and parents, encourage your students to do that on a regular basis. Use a personal email address, so a non-school-based email, so not the school that you're in or the one that the student wants to enroll in. Please follow instructions, and then last but not least, prioritize your time. Seniors right now, an hour a week is what you could set aside and dedicate to this. It could be 15 minutes Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. It doesn't have to be all at the same time, but as long as it's structured and it's something that you can stick to, it's valuable in this process. And then I'll end, as I always do, with family discussions that I always encourage students and families to have in this process. One, because sometimes students are afraid to tell their parents where they want to go to college or what they want to major in. Sometimes as parents, we have expectations of our children, and it might not be what they want for themselves. And sometimes if our kids are not letting us know that, we could keep moving ahead with expectations otherwise. So it's important to talk about what the goals are in this process, whether it's a 2-year school, 4-year school, public, private, engineering, business, nursing, the humanities, whatever those things are. Students and parents need to discuss this, and especially important as a part of that is how to pay for school. Because students, it is your responsibility to pay for college. Parents, it's not your responsibility to pay for your son or daughter's education. If you're in a position where you can help them out, if you've saved money or can help with the partial payment plan, that's great, but you're not expected to do so. Any student that is listening to this presentation, if your parents do that for you, tell them thank you and appreciate that, because they don't have to. Sometimes parents will do that even if it stretches us beyond our means. So just be careful with that, because that's easy to do in this process as well. But have a conversation about budgets. In my household growing up, it was not my business what my mom made, how she paid her bills when she paid her bills. I knew money was going in and out, but it was not my business, essentially, what was going on. I wish my mom had talked to me about budgeting and about how to manage money. One, because there's some mistakes I still make now as an adult from a financial standpoint, where I think we could have nipped that in the bud a little bit earlier in this process if I'd had conversations with my mom But it's also something I think back to. Parents, students, this will be a really stressful year for you and your son or daughter as they navigate this process. The more you talk about this stuff, you'll be surprised what your kids will remember 15, 20 years from now. But have these conversations, talk to them about budgeting. This is where your life experience as parents is invaluable to your children because you've dealt with numbers in terms of 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Your child, for your child, these are all imaginary numbers. They have no concept about how these numbers will impact their life or decisions they can make down the road. So please talk about money and responsible budgeting and answer your children's questions. Share some financial mistakes you've made. Sometimes as children, we think of our parents as perfect or infallible. If you show a little bit more of your human side in this process, one, you're building trust with your kids. They can come to you if they know you've made a mistake or two when they make a mistake and seek out advice and guidance, but just have conversations as you work through this process and make sure everybody's on the same page. There are additional ways to pay for college through service. Talk about whether or not this is the best fit for the student. An educational benefit might not be worth the sacrifice because a lot of these service opportunities require a substantial sacrifice from the student or the individual pursuing these opportunities to help pay for school. So just keep that in mind. And then if you want to learn more, you can reach out to me at the College Place for individual follow-up. Please sign up for times to meet with your college and career counselor, both for students and parents. Go through the formal request process to do that. Don't just show up at offices, but we're here to help. So please ask for support along the way. And then for anybody that's a senior in high school now, or for parents that have students who are already in college and you have another student in school that's working through this process, come to a hands-on FAFSA completion workshop. Dates for that will be coming out soon if they haven't already at each of your schools. And then last but not least is my contact slide. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My name is Jason Pereira. I'm here from the College Place, and I'm here to support you as you navigate through this process. And it's always free guidance and support. Sometimes it does take me a little bit of time to get back to you. So if you send me an email tonight, I'm probably not going to respond right away, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And that's all that I have on my end.
Thank you so much, Mr. Purrier. It's always a pleasure having you, and it's great information that you provide to our families. I see a couple of hands that are raised, and I'm going to ask you to please type your questions in the Q&A. I'll make sure that Ms. Shaver and Ms. Bridges get this information over to Mr. Purrier. So, if there are any additional questions, we'll provide you with answers. As a follow-up tomorrow, I'm going to also provide you with his presentation as well as the video recording for today so that you have it as a reference. We will be putting in the survey in the chat. Please take the time to fill it out. Let us know how we're doing and any future programming that you may want to see from the Family Engagement Series. Thank you again to our presenters, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.